Right now, you're listening to me through the Rodecaster Pro II, and as difficult as it might be to believe, the Rodecaster Pro II has now been out for 4 years. It still gets regular firmware updates, still works great, and as far as I know, there's not really any competition that actually comes close to dethroning it as kind of the best all-around, all-in-one mixer, recorder, interface for podcasts, streaming, events. It just kind of is the one. The 2 is the 1. But of course, there's a little more to it than just that, so I actually have a lot of thoughts here about the Rodecaster Pro II because after 4 years, I think it's reasonable to ask, is there a Rodecaster Pro 3 on the horizon? Which I have zero idea if there is or not. But it's also kind of interesting to look at the landscape of recorder mixer interfaces just to kind of see. It's just kind of impressive how good this is, to be honest with you. But also, it really shows how difficult it has been for competing products to compete. So much so that there really aren't any, which is cool if you own a Rodecaster and you're like, nice, I got the best option. But it's also kind of a negative if you're like, hey, I would like other options, or I would like competition to, keep things competitive. So that way everybody's trying to outdo everybody, and then we as the users get the best products. So where we're at right now is that the Rodecaster Pro II was released in 2022 and the MSRP is $699. It has stayed at that $699 despite the absolute insanity with global pricing, even amongst Rode's own product lineups that have changed in prices a lot. The Rodecaster Pro II, $699. It has received 15 pretty major firmware updates since that release, which is a lot. It's also worth noting that a year later, in 2023, the Rodecaster Duo was released, which I have mine. I don't know if you can, let me move this chair. I have mine on the desk right there, these blurred out lights right there. That's my Rodecaster Duo. That is physically different because it only has 2 XLR inputs. It has fewer faders, but internally, in terms of sound quality, routing, all those capabilities, it is exactly the same as the Rodecaster Pro II. So that came out a year later. That had an MSRP and still does of $499, and that has had 10 firmware updates. So essentially, the Rodecaster Pro II received 5 firmware updates before the Duo was released. And even though those 2 are different products, since the Duo's release, every time there has been a firmware update, it's gone to both devices. So why am I even bringing that up? To answer that question, I need to reach just out of frame and pull out the original Rodecaster Pro from 2019. So this is kind of how I can put the Rodecaster Pro II in perspective and really emphasize that we're in a bit of uncharted territory here. So the original Rodecaster Pro was released in 2019 and received about 10 pretty major firmware updates between that time and the time it was discontinued in 2022. And the thing about that is it totally changed the purpose of this device. I ordered this on day 1 as soon as it was announced because it solved a ton of problems for me. And that was when it was just a multi-track podcast recorder. That was the original intent of the Rodecaster. If we go all the way back then, it was that you could connect multiple microphones, you could have phones, you could have auxiliary inputs, you could have sound effects and sound cues and things, and you could just record it all in one place. Prior to this, at least for me, when I was trying to do multi-track podcasts, I was running microphones into like other mixers. Then I had to deal with headphone amps. Then sometimes you deal with like headphone splitters so that every person could actually listen to their headphones. And then you had to run that into a recorder. It was kind of a mess. And then this just did everything all in one. But it wasn't long after its release that people started to realize you could use the Rodecaster for a lot more than just podcasts. In fact, you could never use the record button at all because this was an amazing interface that you could use for things like streaming and video production, which is kind of not really what it was originally intended for. And so what that means is as people started using it for that stuff and video podcasts, basically once people started folding in video and live streaming components, it's changed the workflow of the Rodecaster. And so a lot of the later firmware updates were really geared towards that. They were kind of shifting this thing from what it was originally intended to be to better suit what it was being used for by a lot of users. So the cool part was in real time, you could see Rode adapting to what its users were doing. But the bad part was that this thing was getting pushed way past its original limits and its original intention, which is why in 2022, there needed to be an update. By the time the original Rodecaster was discontinued, it had been pushed absolutely, past its computational limits, like its processing limits. It couldn't do anything more. If you remember, there was a firmware update near the end that introduced reverb. So in the firmware update, there was just a reverb effect, simple reverb. And then in the firmware release, the reverb had been taken away. And it was kind of like, why is there no reverb? And really, that was kind of like the final limit. Like that was pushing it as far as it could go reliably. And so just adding that simple effect on top of everything else that the Rodecaster had been modified to be able to do, just kind of that pushed it to like, it can't really handle all that, at least in a way that's consistently reliable. So that means Rode actually needed a new product. And that's where the Rodecaster Pro II came into play, which has 16 times the processing capabilities of the original Rodecaster. And originally, when it was released, Rode said that they had firmware updates for 24 months planned, but that was 48 months ago and they're still going. So clearly they have not hit the limit of what the Rodecaster Pro II is capable of. And that's very smart because nobody knew where it was going to go. The Rodecaster Video is a thing that came out 2 years after this release, 2 years ago almost. And that has now changed the workflow, especially because you have the Rodecaster Video Core over there, which now introduces Rodecaster Sync, so that way you can use Rodecasters to control the Rodecaster Video Core. No doubt that feature has to make its way to the other Rodecaster videos at some point. So now you're taking your Rodecaster Pro II from 2022, and you're using it to control video switchers in 2026. And there's still, I'm probably jinxing things by making this video, because as soon as I make this and share it, Rode's going to announce like the Rodecaster Pro 3. But as far as I know, there's no rumors of a Rodecaster Pro 3. I don't really know what it could do. We'll talk kind of more about that at the end. This thing is still going strong, and it still seems to have plenty of processing power inside of it to handle all of the needs that are being thrown at it. And Rode has added so much in terms of routing, in terms of processing, in terms of streaming capabilities, virtual channels. Like, if you just want this to be a simple podcast recorder, it's great. But if you want this to be like a hub for a multi-computer, multi-device streaming setup, it can also handle that really well, to the point that it kind of gets complicated. Like you sort of got to spend some time setting things up and making sure everything's working, because it can do so much. And that brings me to the next section of this video, which is all about the competition, or kind of the lack thereof. So there are competing products. There have been competing Rodecaster products. And it was kind of funny because a lot of the competing products really started popping up right at the end of the original Rodecaster's lifespan. And then, there were some good ones. Like, for example, the Tascam Mixcast was $499. That came out in 2021. And it was like pretty awesome. You could argue it's better than the original Rodecaster. So it's like, hey, this is pretty decent. But then just a few months after its release, the Rodecaster Pro II came out and basically totally dominated it, totally crushed it. The Mixcast has not had a firmware update since 2023 at this point. There's also the Zoom PodTrack P8, which was very Rodecaster Pro I similar, but it even had kind of some more features and some more powerful preamps, although they were a little bit noisy. Its MSRP is $299, so quite affordable. It came out in 2020, but it has not received a firmware update since 2021. So it has not received any kind of attention since 2021. And then there's things like this, the Mackie DLZ Creator line. This is the XS, the small one, and then there's the full-size DLZ Creator. These were, I think, really the best devices for giving the Rodecaster Pro II and the Rodecaster Duo a run for their money. These came out in 2023. The big version had an MSRP of $799, so it's actually more expensive than the Rodecaster Pro II, but it was like bigger and the interface was different, it had a giant screen on it. And then the smaller version has an MSRP of $499, exactly the same as the Rodecaster Duo. And these are excellent, and they still are excellent. They have like a different approach than the Rodecaster, but they're super duper capable. It was really fun to see these competing products with a different approach, but still kind of a high quality approach come out, because that was gonna kind of make Rode be competitive. So much so that Rode's parent company just bought Mackie. And they said after the acquisition that both teams were going to just keep developing products independently and nothing was really going to change. And there has not been a single firmware update for the DLZ lineup since that acquisition in 2023. Or no, it was late 2023 that the company was bought. There has not been a firmware update for the DLZ lineup since February of 2024. And these are essentially dead. If you find them, they still work, as is the case for all the devices that have not received any updates, but they're not going to get any other attention. They're not going to get any new features. They're basically dead. Now, that's not to say there aren't any new products coming out, or there haven't been new products coming out in that time, especially Zoom. I think once they discovered kind of their 32-bit float, like their essential lineup, they sort of rebranded a lot of their products. And those are pretty great and quite affordable. And they have some different like all-in-one mixer recorder things, but they are kind of geared more towards audio-specific workflows, and they are geared towards more portability and simplicity. So there's like the Zoom P4 Next. There's options from Fifine, from Maono. But the thing about those is they don't really seem like they're competing with the Rodecaster at all. They really seem like they're geared more towards a budget market. It's almost like other brands sort of feel like if you're competing at all in the price range of the Rodecaster, just don't, because the Rodecaster is the better choice. But they know that there are people who don't want to spend the price on the Rodecaster. And so instead, if they can go around that sub $100 or sub $200 price point, there's a lot of people who that fits their budget really, really well. And so there are options there. You know, you can go to Amazon and you can just search for like podcast recorder, audio recorder, under $100, and you'll find a whole bunch of stuff from brands you might not have ever really heard of varying levels of quality. There's also then stuff like Elgato. Maybe, I don't even know that would be a competitor because they don't have like a Rodecaster competitor, but Elgato does have at least a full ecosystem. So if you want interfaces, and then you have things like Stream Decks, and then you have their software to process everything, you could be in that ecosystem. But to get in the Elgato ecosystem, you gotta get a lot of different parts to kind of fit in it. It's not just an all-in-one device. There's not really anything that kind of suits this. So Elgato is maybe the highest quality sort of competitor, or at least alternative approach, but it is a very different approach. If you just want like the one thing to rule them all, it's the Rodecaster still. And so that brings me to the verdict, maybe the main point of this, because I've been wondering, like, what is going on with the Rodecaster? I haven't heard rumors of new ones, and this just keeps getting updates, and it keeps doing more things, and getting better and better, and just kind of chugging along. Ultimately, and I really looked, like, trying to put notes together, there's really nothing else that comes close to the Rodecaster in terms of features, quality, and support. We've seen now over the years from 2019 to 2026, from the original Rodecaster to now, every once in a while something will pop up that's like, oh, this is it. This is the challenger. And then it just sort of gets forgotten and left behind. Whereas the Rodecaster comes out and then just gets consistent updates, supports, user feedback and use cases get considered and then put into updates that then change the way the device works so that it can do more things that people want it to do. The area that the Rodecaster Pro II has fallen short from what it was originally promised, which is something that has just not really been mentioned since it was originally promised, is music production. That was something that originally it was like podcasting, streaming, and music. Those are sort of like the three things that it was advertised as being able to do. And when it comes to music, the Rodecaster is pretty weak. Boss, a while ago, came out with the Gigcaster, which was pretty sweet for really kind of is a Rodecaster geared more towards music. And it's awesome because it has like virtual instruments, virtual amps. It's the best way to record, music in a podcast type device. The downside to that is that the podcast part of it was a little bit lackluster and it wasn't as nice as the Rodecaster. So if you have a primarily music-based workflow with a little bit of like spoken word type stuff, then it's good. But if you do spoken word and music, or mostly spoken word with a little music, then the Gigcaster was just like not the best device to use. And again, nothing hasn't been updated, hasn't been changed since then. So even now, if you're into music production, it's probably best just to use a Rodecaster for like spoken word type stuff, and then use traditional like instrument interfaces and DAW programs for processing your instruments and virtual amps and things like that. versus the Rodecaster. So that is really the biggest weakness. But again, there's not been anything else that has actually come forward and challenged that, other than the boss several years ago. But the boss kind of turned out to be more of an employee because it didn't really take charge of the situation. So when we're talking about a potential update to the Rodecaster, this is totally just my like theories and personal opinions, not based on any like facts or anything. There has to be an update at some point, right? Like, this is 4 years old. I can't imagine this goes for 10 years and is just like the Rodecaster Pro II. At some point, there has to be a Rodecaster Pro III or equivalent, but I really don't know. Like, if you think of what does that need in order to exist, I don't know, because keep in mind, most people don't buy multiple audio interfaces. They're not getting new ones every time one comes out, especially now. Like, this is so good and so well developed that even if at this point where it currently is, if Rode did stop support with this and moved on to something else, this is still going to be very, very capable and very, very functional for a long time to come. People don't need to update their audio interfaces, their podcast recorders, like even as often as a phone or something like that. So I think Rode is kind of aware of that. It's better to make one device more and more functional and give it support so that users want to buy into it, rather than trying to sell a bunch of different devices. And realistically, this is also, again, just my thought, the way Rode works, they own their factory, which is kind of cool because literally like their design offices and their factory are connected. So the people who design the products can like walk over and actually see the manufacturing process. And I think that does lead to better products overall. But also with that in mind, changing a manufacturing process, changing a factory, changing materials and all that stuff is very expensive. So financially, it's kind of in the better interest for them as a company to continue to use the existing stuff as long as possible and just make that better and better, because then it costs you less money. And I don't know a lot about business, but I know companies like making money while spending as little money as possible. That's what I know. So when it comes to a Rodecaster Pro update, my thought is that it really needs to change the workflow the same way that the Rodecaster Pro II really did address and adapt to changing workflows, where the original Rodecaster was a podcast recorder that was then kind of like adapted for streaming and video type stuff. The Rodecaster Pro II came into that world knowing it is for everything: streaming, podcasting, gaming, not so much music, but all that other stuff. It needs to handle all of that. And so what would the next transformative workflow be? I don't know, but I can just think from my point of view as a customer, what would make me want to buy a new Rodecaster would be sort of a combination of Rodecaster Pro II and Rodecaster Video. And I'm just going to put my dream wish list type thing out there. We are already seeing the Rodecaster Video and Rodecaster Pro lineup, you know, more and more compatibility. You can connect Rodecaster Pros to Rodecaster Videos and break out all the audio and use them for auto switching and all that. You can now start to connect Rodecaster Videos to Rodecaster Pros and control them that way. So there's kind of like that symbiotic relationship. The problem is I don't like connecting multiple devices. That gets clunky, that gets messy. It's a little frustrating. So the thing that would change my workflow, that would make me really want to jump from the regular Rodecaster to something new, would be like, what did I call it? I called it something. Oh yeah, a Rodecaster Video Pro. So you take the Rodecaster Pro, you take the Rodecaster Video, and you smush them together into one actual device with just a ton of physical controls. That I would love. Also 4K. So again, we're just dreaming here. You take something like this. I don't care if it's even a little bit bigger. It has all these physical controls, all the great audio, all the great processing, virtual channels, routing, all of that. But I also now have 4K video switching, at least 4 channels of 4K in here, and I can then use these controls to adjust that. I can switch between that. Maybe we throw in some Stream Deck-like buttons that aren't just colored, but they can, you know, show contextually what's happening on there. That would be awesome. Maybe we need a bit of a bigger display so that way we can see all our inputs. This would be like a hefty production unit. It would not be $799 or whatever this price is. But that's the kind of thing that currently would transform a workflow. Now we're eliminating capture cards, we're eliminating audio interfaces running together separately, and we just have one big, awesome device that gives us great multi-track audio, and 4K multi-track video. I'm just gonna say 4K because why not? Now, I do recognize that is kind of asking for a lot and it would be very expensive, but that kind of goes to show, I guess, how good the Rodecaster Pro II still is. So if you're on the fence, if you're like, I need something, I've been thinking about a Rodecaster, but I know it's been out for a while, is it worth getting? You don't really have any other viable options, to be honest. And even if the Rodecaster is eventually updated, the current ones are still going to be good for a long time in the future, because the thing that's really going to change this workflow and really going to take Rodecaster Pro users and make them want to upgrade is something that completely transforms the workflow in a different way. The only thing I can really think of is either adding in video capability built in and or music capability. And that's something that I think then a lot of people would want to update. Until then, the Rodecaster Pro II, still a super solid choice for you to go to.